Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting on Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada. The objective of today's meeting is to continue the committee's thorough review of the bill. Now, I do have a fairly substantive preamble here, so please bear with me. I would like to take a moment to remind both those participating in the proceedings as well as those observing the proceedings of the committee in person and on video that the committee adopted a motion on September 18th, which included instructions for the clerk to explore options to allow for full participation of all witnesses and members of the public on this study. As a result, the committee has made arrangements to make all meetings in relation to the study of Bill C-81 as accessible as possible in a variety of ways. This includes providing sign language interpretation and near real-time closed captioning in the room. Please note that both American Sign Language and Quebec Sign Language are being offered to those in our audience. For those who would like to watch the American Sign Language interpretation, please sit on the benches to my left. For those who would like to watch the Quebec Sign Language interpretation, please sit in the benches to my right. In addition, please note that the first two rows of benches have been reserved for those who wish to avail themselves of these interpretation services. Screens displaying the near real-time closed captioning have also been set up, with the English text again to my left and the French text to my right. The sign language interpreters in the room are also being video recorded for the eventual broadcast of the meeting on Parleview via the committee's website. In light of these arrangements, the committee would ask that if you need to leave the room during the meeting, please do not walk in front of the sign language interpreters. Instead, please use the extremities of the room. In addition, we would ask that those in the room remain seated as much as possible during the meeting, so that everyone in the audience can clearly see the sign language interpretation. Finally, if a member of the audience requires assistance at any time, please notify a member of the staff or the committee clerk. I wanted to just sort of check with the interpreters if my speed and cadence was appropriate, if they could give me a thumbs up. Fantastic. So I asked that because in the previous meetings, we have gone a little quick in some of our, whether it's opening statements or questions and answers. I'm going to apologize in advance. I will, if given an indication by the interpreters, to slow you down. Don't worry about time. We're very conscious that everyone wants to get the message out. And that we are limited in time, but I have been, no pun intended, a little liberal on the timing and give people a couple more moments to finish their statements and stay at a slower pace. So what I'm going to do is if I believe we need to slow down, I'll just sort of indicate this way, okay? Just want to introduce those who are here with us today, both in person and via video conference. Appearing as an individual, we have Jutta Travianis, Professor and Director, Inclusive Design Research Center, OCAD University. By video conference, coming to us from France. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. I can hear you very well.
Fantastic. Also joining us here by video conference from Barrier Free Canada, we have Donna Jodhan, founder and chair. Welcome. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Fantastic. Appearing here with us today, we have Michael Prince, professor of social policy, Facility of Human and Social Development, University of Victoria. Welcome. Also from People First of Canada, we have Corey Earle, President, and Shelley Fletcher, Executive Director. Welcome. And from Public Service Alliance of Canada, we have Marianne Haladan, Regional Executive Vice President, Prairies Region, and Seema Lamba, Human Rights Program Officer, Negotiations and Programs Branch. And I thoroughly apologize if I butchered both those names there. Each group will receive 7 minutes for your opening statements, and we are going to start with Jutta Travianis coming to us from France. The next 7 minutes are all yours.
Thank you. I am the director of something called the Inclusive Design Research Center, who has the mission of proactively ensuring that emerging technologies are designed inclusively. And so we focus on inclusive design for our digitally transformed, complexly connected society. We just turned 25 this year, and we are engaged in many collaborative and international projects. What I want to focus on in my statement is the areas that are where we have the most unique expertise. And this is the impact of the domain of digitally transformed and complexly connected society on people experiencing disabilities. And I also take a systems view of the goal of accessibility for people with disabilities to address not just the symptoms of exclusion, but the underlying systemic causes. First, I should tell you how we define disability within the design domain and within the data domain. From the design perspective, we see disability as a mismatch between the needs of the individual and the environment, product, or service offered, not a defining personal trait. And from a data perspective, disability is the outlying edge of the starburst that is the normal distribution, sufficiently far from the central cluster for whom most things are designed, so that things are not designed for you and you have difficulty or can't use the current designs. People with disabilities are the outliers. The primary defining characteristic of disability is difference from the norm. And thinking of that starburst, people experiencing disabilities are more different from each other than people who are clustered around the average. As you move from the center, the dots are farther apart. This means that people experiencing disabilities are served by systems and processes that are designed for variability and complexity. Any evidence related to persons experiencing disabilities will be dispersed and diffuse. There are no large numbers of homogeneous representatives, and therefore there is no statistical significance. Also, of note, majority rules does not serve people with disabilities. So how is a digitally connected domain different from other domains that you may hear about in terms of accessibility? Interoperability is the most difficult and pernicious issue in the digital domain. Once adoption begins, barriers propagate and morph extremely quickly and are almost impossible to contain. Inaccessible conventions lock in and are impossible to reverse. Try to get rid of the QWERTY keyboard. Therefore, retrofit, which is possible but expensive in other domains, is almost impossible in the digital domain. Timing is also extremely critical and does not follow a predetermined schedule. There's no benefit in scheduling a 5-year review. People experiencing disabilities are the most vulnerable to threats caused by the digital transformation, but also provide the most compelling benefits for emerging technologies. Technical systems can be designed to provide one size fits one. They can present a different entry point or user experience to each individual. What are the failures and weaknesses of current legislative frameworks? Technical regulations cannot keep up and may become outdated. Then accessibility is seen as an impediment to innovation and progress. Most regulations treat the symptoms and not the cause. We have regulations regarding inaccessible documents rather than the authoring tools that produce them. We focus on the products, not the process. Accessibility is usually also a gatekeeping role, which leads to resentment, not as part of the design from the start, where we should be thinking about accessibility in the digital domain. We focus on accessibility as an obligation, not as a benefit. We should see it as an impetus for innovation, long-term cost reduction, longevity of design. We need to provide the economic modeling to highlight the significant return on investment. We have amassed evidence to this effect. Also, any available supports, tools, training, and expertise that are provided with respect to supporting the regulations are often fragmented, contradictory, confusing, and redundantly produced. The all-too-common checklist approach requires reductionism and increases the barriers for anyone not included or served by the checklist. We have promoted also, with respect to accessibility and computer access, a segregated, not an integrated computer access strategy, promoting an assistive technology industry as a separate, not integrated technology. This is not viable. It increases the cost and reduces the interoperability. And this has become a barrier to digital equity when it was seen originally as a solution. The emerging threats that we need to, and opportunities that we need to pay attention to, include our emphasis on evidence-based governance. The form of evidence requires large homogeneous groups. People with disabilities are not homogeneous and will not pass any thresholds with respect to evidence. Artificial intelligence and decisions based on population data take automated vehicles and outliers. They do not take into account people who are outliers, and people with disabilities are outliers. Data-guided decisions perpetuate past exclusion as they use data of the past. If you've never held an employment position, there's no evidence of your ability to perform within that position, and so you will never get chosen for the job. With respect to privacy, de-identification of people with disabilities does not work. People with disabilities are the easiest to re-identify and the most vulnerable to data abuse and misuse. Blockchains and other disintermediated systems create the challenge of who do you regulate. There is no service provider that you can ask to create accessible systems. Current project planning, monitoring, and evaluation processes impose assumptions in unpredictable variable domains that people with disabilities experience. There are some silver linings. Open platforms offer an opportunity. They can be a means of aggregating and sharing resources, tools, and knowledge, matching unmet personal needs and connecting demands at the edge with producers at the edge. They can diversify demand and supply to reach the edges where people with disabilities are. So I just have 5 recommendations. The first is we should support inclusive research and innovation. There's currently a systemic bias against research in this area because there is a lack of statistical significance and there are not enough peers to review the research. We should integrate accessibility into all research support throughout the process, the call for proposal in determining the success criteria and in the peer review. Second recommendation, we should emphasize systemic processes for long-term change. Encourage diversification, not competition for one winning alternative. Participation of informed, diverse perspectives in our decision-making processes, and integrate inclusive design training for all relevant roles. My third recommendation is that our intervention should be timely and proactive. We should designate and empower a role for vigilant monitoring and power to intervene in emerging technology processes, or a watchdog role for emerging technologies and practices. That is the only way that we will, within this domain, stop catching up, but actually be able to equitably participate. We need to produce and provide authoring and development tools that produce accessible content, programs, and services through procurement. You'll save innumerable hours and effort in remediating inaccessible content if you design it accessibly from the start, and this is supported in the authoring and development tools. And I recommend that we establish a community portal that pools resources, tools, research, and constructive feedback from the public and from other individuals that are innovating in this domain, and thereby reduces fragmentation. This doesn't need to mean that the government is supporting any one solution, but that it is pooling the resources such that the public and people with expertise, especially individuals experiencing disabilities, can review and support the systems.
And now for 7 minutes from Barrier Free Canada, coming to us by video conference from Toronto, Ontario, Donna Jodhan, founder and chair. The next 7 minutes are all yours.
Good morning. My name is Donna Jodhan, and I'm the president and chair of Barrier Free Canada. And we are a grassroots, nonpartisan organization. We were founded in late 2014, and we were instrumental in kickstarting the campaign for the Canadian government to pass legislation to enact a Canadians with Disabilities Act for Barrier-Free Canada. At the present time, we are supported by over 25 national organizations across Canada, and we have been endorsed by the cities of Toronto and Halifax, and individual support continues to grow steadily with a present base of about 2,000 persons across the country. Our founding organizations include the CNIB, the MS Society, March of Dimes, Accessible Media Inc., and the Canadian Hearing Society. We continue to advocate for legislation to make Canada a barrier-free country, and as part of our initiative, we have developed 14 principles which we believe can help to form the foundation of said legislation. You can find out about our principles by going to www.barrierfreecanada.org. In our Appendix A, which we have submitted, we have included the list of the 14 principles, along with a comparison of what we believe have not been included in this proposed legislation. So, for brevity, I will propose what the legislation does not include in each of our principles. Barrier Free Canada is grateful for having been given this opportunity to have our voice heard. We believe that when this act is passed, it will go down in history as one of the most important pieces of legislation as it pertains to the rights of Canadians with disabilities, to their friends and to their families. And we look forward to continued collaboration with the Canadian government on this very important piece of legislation. I will now talk about the comparisons as they pertain to each of the Barrier Free Canada principles. So for Principle 1, this principle, in our respectful view, has not been endorsed. There are no meaningful deadlines or time horizons that are specified by the legislation. Even if a deadline were established in a regulation, there is nothing in the legislation that prescribes a penalty for failing to meet such a deadline. For Principle 2, this principle has been partly endorsed. The legislation does appear to cover all persons with disabilities. The legislation does appear to address the range of barriers anticipated in this principle. The legislation does appear to apply to the federal government and regulated entities and organizations, but the legislation does not appear to extend requirements to organizations that receive federal grants, subsidies, loans, or other funds. The legislation does not appear to extend requirements to organizations which provide goods and services to the federal government. For Principle 3, in principle, the legislation is drafted and is not intended to override or displace any existing protections or mechanisms for enforcement that are available to people with disabilities. Given that the regulations have not yet been developed, it is not possible to assess at this time whether the Act is stronger or weaker than existing provisions. For Principle 4, the Act does not really aim for full accessibility or inclusion. It strives to achieve through the progressive realization of a Canada without barriers. Progressive realization does not imply any particular deadline or meter stick against which progress is to be measured. For the fifth principle, to the extent that regulated entities provide goods and services in this manner, the legislation does require that implementation plans be made to identify and remove barriers, and it is not clear that the legislation could drive product development, accessibility requirements, e.g., shared services, information technology services. For Principle 6, there are presently no prescribed timelines, but this is otherwise included in the Act. For Principle 7, the legislation does not clearly demonstrate how Canada will take a lead role in implementation. Taking that lead role could begin today. Canada should not wait for the legislation or regulations to be finalized before taking proactive steps towards implementation within its own departments. Canada should be seen as leading the charge. For Principle 8, the Act does provide for another complete resolution process outside of the traditional court venues. The Act, however, does not appear to include any mandatory enforcement provisions. The Accessibility Commissioner has broad enforcement powers, but those powers may be used, not more. Barrier-free for the ninth principle, the Act does provide some sector by sector separations to at least in respect of a few designated sectors. It is not clear how input from affected groups and organizations will be gathered or consolidated. There is a suggestion in the Act, but not a hard rule, that a majority of the board of directors of the standard setting body will be people with disabilities, but absolutely no requirement that persons with disabilities will dominate on the technical and advisory committees. For Principle 10, these issues do not appear to be addressed by the legislation at all. For Principle 11, these issues do not appear to be addressed by the legislation at all. Certainly, there is no mention in the legislation of applying a disability lens to policy and legislative development. For Principle 12, these issues do not appear to be addressed by the legislation at all. For number 13, this may be happening at a policy level, but there is no direct reflection of it in the federal legislation. And finally, for number 14, the degree to which the Act is permissive but not mandatory undermines its potential to have real force, effect, and teeth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now, appearing as an individual, Michael Prince, Professor of Social Policy, Faculty of Human and Social Development, University of Victoria. Welcome, sir. The next 7 minutes are all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me just read some opening remarks. Members of this standing committee will hear from a variety of witnesses on a wide range of issues regarding this bill and the vision of a barrier-free Canada. There is much to applaud in this historic bill, which seeks to advance the principles of full and equal participation of Canadians with disabilities in all areas of society, whatever a person's abilities and disabilities. There are also areas of concern with this bill, and as Don has just laid out, these include the absence of measurable targets with specific deadlines, the permissive language in the bill in many sections, the extent of exemptions, the lack of a disability lens, the absence of duties on the Government of Canada for promoting accessibility on the 600-plus First Nation communities across the country, the status of ASL and LSQ and rights to communication, the complex model of federal bodies involved in enforcement and adjudication, and the status of the proposed Chief Accessibility Officer as a Government in Council appointee rather than an Officer of Parliament. I'm happy to talk about any of those later in discussion. My focus this morning is on what Donna just identified as principle number 2 in the list of principles by Barrier Free Canada. I wish to focus on the topic of the scope of application of the proposed Act. That is, the entities to which the Act will be relevant and seek to influence and support in advancing the inclusion and participation for Canadians with disabilities. The application of the Act is set out in Section 7 of the bill. It outlines various types of entities related to the Federal Public Service, the Canadian Forces, and other related parts of the Federal Public Administration. The question I wish to pose to the committee for your consideration is the full scope of application, is this the full scope of application we should have and that we need to have in order to achieve the fundamental purpose of this Act? Canadians, I believe, have higher expectations and larger ambitions in ensuring a barrier-free society. This certainly is apparent from the extensive cross-country consultations on the planned legislation that took place from July 2016 to February 2017. I wish to recommend that the scope of the bill and its intended barrier-free objectives be extended to non-federally regulated employers and other organizations, to federal contractors, those organizations, whether federally or provincially regulated, who wish to do business with the Government of Canada, whether that's in producing and providing goods and services on behalf of Parliament and the Government of Canada, and those organizations receiving significant grants, loans, and subsidies. I propose that subsection 7.1 be amended by adding a new item that would state any entity, business, or organization with 100 or more employees and in receipt of goods and services contracts valued at $200,000 with the Government of Canada. This recommendation recognizes the substantial and strategic role of the Government of Canada as a funder and as a contractor. It is a role well within the constitutional authority of Parliament and a long-standing practice in federal public policy and financial arrangements. It refers to what some might call the federal spending power. The idea for this proposed amendment is informed not only by the work of Barrier Free Canada, but in practice by the Federal Contractors Program, first established in 1986 to advance the implementation of the Employment Equity Act. As an established platform, the Federal Contractors Program has real potential to encourage positive changes in human resources policies and in raising awareness and shifting attitudes, thus empowering persons with disabilities. The Federal Contractors Program could be updated to add alongside its long-standing goal of promoting the diversity of workforces, the goal of ensuring the accessibility of workplaces, both as built environments and as places of human relations and attitudes, as well as advancing the accessibility of services and program delivery in those places. This recommendation is also compatible, I think, with the application of certain powers for the proposed Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization. Under Section 19A of the bill, that organization can enter into contracts, agreements, or other arrangements with any person or entity, including any government. Under Section 20, the Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization would be authorized to develop accessibility standards for any person or entity, including any government in Canada or elsewhere. To support this recommendation, a new series of sections would need to be added in Part 4 of the bill, largely following the format and content of the sections already contained therein for regulated entities in broadcasting, in telecommunications, and in transportation. I assume that some of those sections may well be the subject of amendments too. But Part 4 could be amended by adding new sections, provisionally sections 73 to 79, that would outline the requirements for entities that I've suggested be added to Section 7.1. These entities would be required to have in place accessibility plans and actions. The new part of Part 4 could be called Regulated Entities in Receipt of Federal Contracts or Loans or Subsidies for Goods and Services and others. These new sections would therefore address the requirements that for organizations to receive federal fundings or contracts to have in place an initial accessibility plan, the establishment of process, et cetera, et cetera. So just in brief, in conclusion, in my submission, I identified 2 recommended amendments to the bill, and I'm happy to talk more about the application or many other aspects of this historic piece of legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And now from People First of Canada, we are joined by Corey Earle, President, and Shelley Fletcher, Executive Director. Thank you both for being here, and the next 7 minutes are yours.
Excuse me. Good morning, Chair and members of the committee. For those of you who do not know who we are, People First of Canada is the national voice for people labeled with intellectual disabilities. We want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for allowing us to have the chance to have the voices heard. We would first like to say that we're very pleased that Canada is moving forward with a Federal Accessibility Act that will help remove and prevent barriers to inclusions that people with disabilities experience every day in this country. Since the beginning of this act, People First Canada has been part of the work and consultations held across this country. We have worked with the national disability community and the federal government to get as many people with disabilities as possible to give their input on this act as it was being built. We also went to great efforts to ensure that the voice of people with intellectual disabilities was represented in the consultations right across this country. Having a disability is not cheap. Many people with disabilities cannot afford all the supports they need to fully participate in society. By and large, people with disabilities live in poverty more than most other groups in society. Within the disability community, people with intellectual disabilities live in poverty more than other people with disabilities. In the principal sections of the Act, 6, B, C, and D, it states that all persons must have the same opportunity to make for themselves the lives that they are able to and wish to have, and that all persons must have a barrier-free access to full and equal participation in society, and that all persons must have a meaningful options and be free to make their own choices and support if they desire, regardless of their abilities or disabilities. But without disability supports, many people with intellectual disabilities will not have these opportunities, access, or meaningful options because they do not have the disability supports to take part. Disability supports are an important part of having a full and equal participation in society and should be addressed in this Act. Plain language has been a long-standing concern for people with intellectual disabilities. This is an accommodation right to receive information in a format that is accessible to our members. Since the beginning of the work on the Act, People First of Canada has been pushing for documents and information in plain language. But really, we have been accommodated. In fact, most documents about the Act that are in plain language were either requested by or produced by People First of Canada. We have seen some regulations mention plain language, but they are not written in plain language. We are concerned that further documents around the Act will not be accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. We are asking that the government produce plain language documents about the Act. This will accommodate people with intellectual disabilities, and it will also make the information more accessible to many others, like people who have with low literacy, and print disabilities, as well as seniors and new Canadians.
We feel that the Act needs to have timelines and deadlines listed for the changes required, as well as for reporting on these changes. Without deadlines, organizations may not do what they need to in order to increase accessibility and remove barriers. There needs to be timelines for putting regulations in place as well. Without timelines and deadlines in the Act, how can we check to see that the Act is working? We ask that the Act be changed to include timelines and deadlines for changes in reporting. People First of Canada strongly believes that all complaints about the Act not being followed need to go to the Accessibility Commissioner. Right now, the Act has different ways to make complaints that are based on what organization is being complained about. It is confusing and will make it harder for people with intellectual disabilities to make complaints when an organization is not following the Act. We also strongly believe that the Act needs to be enforced by the Accessibility Commissioner and not by individual organizations or agencies. We believe the Act must be the same in all areas and that certain organizations should not get to make their own rules. We ask that the Act be changed so there is one complaint process and that process is through the Accessibility Commissioner. We're concerned about standards in the new Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization, CASDO. This new standards organization will develop the standards that will become regulations to be followed. We feel that this organization must include people with intellectual disabilities on their board and in their work. This organization needs representation from people with lived experience in order to do its job of identifying, removing, and preventing barriers through creating accessibility standards. We also believe that people with intellectual disabilities need to be included in the monitoring of the Act to make sure government is making changes based on what the United Nations says it must do for people with disabilities. We think there's too much time before the Act is reviewed to see if it's working. We think it should be reviewed much sooner than stated in the Act, which is 5 years after the first regulation under the Act is made.
Intellectual disability is complex when it comes to accommodation. And in the past, we have not done a good job of including and supporting people with intellectual disabilities in our society. Historically, our group has been devalued in some of the worst ways through institutionalization, forced sterilization, abuses, and murder. We were probably the last group to the tables where decisions about us were being made. To this day, within the larger disability community, people with intellectual disabilities are still referred to as the left behind of the left behind. For us, this Act is a positive step forward toward ensuring an inclusive and accessible Canada that values everyone. With the necessary changes to that, we believe this is a chance for us to have a more accessible country where we are truly valued, present, and included. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. And finally, from Public Service Alliance of Canada, we have Marianne Haladin, Regional Executive Director, Vice President, Prairies Region, and Seema Lamba, Human Rights Program Officer, Negotiations and Programs Branch. Thank you both for joining us. 7 minutes, please.
Thank you. The Public Service Alliance of Canada strongly believes that persons with disabilities should be able to fully and equitably participate in all aspects of Canadian society. Our union represents thousands of federal public sector workers, and so I'll be focusing on accessibility and employment and the impact on employees with disabilities in the federal sector. Both Bill C-81 and the 20-year-old Federal Employment Equity Act require federal employers to create plans to eliminate barriers in employment for persons with disabilities. While the EE Act is imperfect, it does provide an established framework that employers and unions have been working under for many years. We recommend improving the Employment Equity Act and referring the employment aspects of C-81 to the EE Act provisions for several reasons. C-81 only mentions the EE Act twice and makes no reference to how the two pieces of legislation will work together. This overlap and lack of clarity will create confusion for employers, employees with disabilities, and unions. In order to comply with both pieces of legislation, employers will have to create two plans, which at least in part do the same thing. What if the two plans conflict? Will one plan override the other? The EE Act requires employers to consult and collaborate with bargaining agents in preparing, implementing, and revising their employment equity plans. C-81 only requires employers to consult with persons with disabilities when creating accessibility plans. C-81 is vague about what should be included in those accessibility plans, while the Employment Equity Act is very specific about what must be included in employment equity plans. We strongly recommend amending Section 5A of C-81 to clarify that accessibility in employment must be dealt with under the provisions of the Employment Equity Act, and that all regulated entities are responsible for implementing employment equity for persons with disabilities. All other references to employment in the bill should then be amended to reflect this change. C-81 does not address hiring and supporting employees with disabilities, nor does it mention the role of the Treasury Board as the employer for the federal public service, or the role of the Public Service Commission, which oversees federal public service staffing. The Employment Equity Act does include these responsibilities. The duty to accommodate in the workplace is also an important aspect of accessibility in employment. Even with the protection of the Canadian Human Rights Act, public service workers continue to be routinely denied accommodation at work. The Treasury Board directive on leave and special working arrangements effectively discriminates against many employees with disabilities who are on long-term sick leave by effectively forcing them to retire from the public service after 2 years. Accommodation-related grievances and human rights complaints often take years before they're resolved. The Joint Union Management Task Force on Diversity and Inclusion recommended that a centralized, systematic approach be developed for accessibility and accommodations, including centralized funding for accommodations. Right now, the responsibilities are devolved to departments, resulting in a patchwork of approaches and applications of the employer's duty to accommodate. To fix this, C-81 should be amended to require Treasury Board and the Public Service Commission to make annual public progress reports to the Accessibility Commissioner, and to require departments and agencies in the core public service to provide progress reports to Treasury Board. To require Treasury Board to set up a central accommodation fund for the public service, and to require that all federal government policies be reviewed to examine and eliminate any barriers to persons with disabilities. We also recommend making consequential amendments to the Financial Administration Act and the Public Service Employment Act to centralize disability-related issues and accessibility in the public service, and to ensuring Treasury Board and the Public Service Commission are responsible for those issues and cannot delegate that responsibility. C81 provides that individuals can file complaints regarding a contravention of the regulations, but there's no way to file a complaint about a violation of the Act. This unfairly limits the substance of complaints. For example, an individual can't file a complaint if an organization doesn't even have an accessibility plan. The complaints provision are also unevenly applied to unionized employees in the federal sector. C81 allows for workers covered under all the federal public service labor laws to take their complaints through the grievance process. However, it does not do the same for federal public and private sector workers who are covered under Canada Labor Code. All workers who have recourse through a collective agreement should be allowed to have their complaints heard through the grievance process, and the arbitrator should have the power to interpret and apply the Accessible Canada Act. The grievance process has embedded within it a right to appeal and review decisions, and it allows workers to file a grievance that addresses multiple workplace issues, including accessibility, without making them pursue multiple parallel complaint processes. We recommend amending Section 94(1) to allow a complaint to be filed in relation to a contravention by a regulated entity of any provision of this Act or any regulations made under subsection 117(1). We also recommend including an additional exception similar to those in sections 94(2), 3, and 4 that applies to all unionized workers under the Canada Labor Code that will ensure these workers can access the grievance and arbitration process. Finally, we recommend that adequate funds be allocated to the Accessibility Commissioner, the Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organization, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission to ensure that these organizations can fulfill their mandates under the new Act. Thank you. Ms. Lambert and I are pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you. I just want to confirm with the translators that the speed is so far okay. Yes, excellent. And we're going to go over to start questions to MP Barlow, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your excellent input. It is certainly beneficial when you come to the table with some suggestions and potential solutions. That certainly helps us a great deal as we wade our way through this. Now, several of you brought up several of the concerns that we have also raised regarding the lack of timelines and meaningful deadlines to establish standards in terms of exactly what this bill is intended to achieve. So I'll start with Ms. Johan first. You were the first to bring it up about that there are no meaningful timelines or deadlines in this legislation. In your opinion, or in Barrier-Free Canada's, if you've done some work on this, what would you like to see as part of this bill in terms of deadlines and a timeline to have standards in place? What would be something for Barrier-Free Canada that you would like to see as part of this legislation?
Thank you very much. I think as far as Barrier-Free Canada is concerned, I think it is very important that timelines and deadlines be firmly in place. And a good timeline probably, in our humble opinion, would be maybe for the first 2 years or after the first 2 years after this legislation has been passed, that there be some sort of timeline or deadline whereby, you know, we can judge what has gone on and what needs to be put in place or what needs to be worked on.
Thank you. And I know, Mr. Prince, you also brought this issue up. Would you share that opinion? Is that a 2-year timeline at least? And I think she's right in terms of there's no metrics in this bill to understand what what we're trying to achieve and what the goal is.
Right.
What would be maybe your suggestion as a recommendation
Sure.
when it comes to that?
Well, I think the concept of progressive realization, which is identified early on as one of the guiding principles of this bill, certainly reflects international practice, the UN, and thinking in other jurisdictions. I think what we need to do is flesh out what that actually means. And so I'm of the school of thought that there, as we see in some provincial laws on accessibility, whether that's Ontario, Manitoba, or Nova Scotia now, an aspirational statement that could be, for example, the Ontario Act put out a 20-year time horizon for a barrier-free Ontario in 2005. So that's working towards 2025 with 5-year updates and reviews. Another feature in some of the laws is that what might be called put your own house in order first, or the idea of the Government of Canada and Parliament of Canada and the larger federal public service being a model employer and being a model organization. And so, so that the obligations may be phased in first on timelines and deadlines that would pertain to federal public sector, federal public administration, and that for some of the sectors I'm suggesting be included further out, some of the nonprofits, foundations, even my own university, you know, perhaps that's second phase, private sector conversations, but there be a staggered wave of deadlines and timelines for different sectors that would cascade out. That'd be another approach. You see that across a lot of countries and other jurisdictions. And certainly the reviews then would be more timely than waiting till the first regulations and then 5 years after that. That probably suggests we wouldn't have our first review till about 2025 or 2026. That's very troubling
Right.
in terms of an age of accountability and transparency. I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And you kind of touched on my next question there briefly in your answer as well. And I think in our opinion that I think all of us here would agree that this is a very important step forward. This is something that is needed and certainly welcome. But we also want to ensure it's done correctly. And there's not a lot of point to rush something like this through and just, you know, so we can put a sticker or check a box off without really having any meat to this legislation. And one of the other issues that concerns me with this bill, the way it is written right now, is it is really a lot of as do as I say, not as I do, where the number of exemptions that are in this legislation, where almost every federal government department can apply for an exemption, but federally regulated private sector industries cannot. I think there should be a level, or in my opinion, or I'd like your opinion, should this be treated equally among all these different organizations? And to me, it sends a very poor message that you know, we want the federally regulated industries to do this, but the government departments actually we're not probably going to do this. What is your opinion on that?
I used to teach at Carleton in the School of Public Administration, lived here many years. Both my daughters born here. I now live on the West Coast in Victoria. This bill to me reflects that it was written in the bubble of Ottawa with respect. This is written from the point of view of traditional management focus to organizational focus. This is not people-centered. This is about departments making sure that in the negotiations and drafting this bill, exemptions and deals were cut. I understand every legislation is a bunch of compromises. This one, it's all over it in terms of broadcasting, transportation, and other. And sectors that should be in this bill that are missing. Let's do this right, and let's do it thoughtfully. The fact that almost page after page in sections 4 and 5, exemptions, exceptions, exceptions, exemptions, that's a terrible message to talk about fundamental human rights. I don't know if we do this with other groups, but you know, we've signed the UN Convention, so I find it disturbing. I think it should be a level playing field. This is basically a machinery of government bill. It's not. There's not much social policy or public policy in this bill. This should be about people front and center. I get it. We have to have administrative and enforcement and compliance. And on that note, I'd like to see a lot more about incentives and education. The minister's talked quite eloquently over the last year, and when she was the minister before, a few years back, talked about education. That we, you know, if we're going to roll out this in an effective implementation, we have to have education happening at the same time. We have to prepare Canadians to accept addressing some systemic attitudinal barriers and what Huta talked about, some of the systemic practices in the digital domain and others. That's going to take education. I'd like to see more carrots in this and not a bunch of real or implied sticks.
Thank you very
I believe in enforcement. We need a strong law, but we also need to send message of support and education and persuasion in this bill.
Thank you very much. MP Long, please.
Well, thank you, Chair, and good morning to our witnesses. Thank you for your presentations. In my riding of St. John Rosse, Bill C-81 certainly has been met with a lot of, excitement, anticipation, and hope. I work directly with organizations like CCRW and Key Industries and other organizations that, finally see, maybe things aren't perfect, but, light at the end of that tunnel where, as a government, we are moving forward and, changing the culture that this isn't only an opportunity for people with disabilities, but an opportunity for all Canadians. And so I guess I've got so many questions I want to ask, but I think I'm going to start with just the CASTO board and how the board is comprised. And I know, part 2 of the bill proposes 50+1 of CASTO board seats be allocated to people with disabilities. We certainly heard some concerns around the table about the composition of that board. So I think my first question is to Ms. Joden. How do you believe this section could be rewritten in order to address your concerns regarding the degree to which these appointments are considered?
These appointments are to be ones that would be of value to this act. I believe that these appointments should be made so that persons with disabilities have a voice at this table, and that these appointments are not ones that the appointees will not be influenced by any outside forces or internal forces, because it is very, very important, I think, for persons who are with a disability, and I'm vision impaired, to really feel that they are being heard, to really feel that they're being understood. Because as Professor Prince mentioned a little while back, there are so many barriers for us to face, not just artificial barriers, but attitudinal barriers, tangent barriers, intangent barriers. So coming back to your question, sir, I think the appointments should be really closely examined and really closely, take into consideration a lot of things that would determine that these appointments are legitimate, that they're not like sort of window dressing. Thank you.
Thank you for that. To Corey and Shelley, would you like to see seats explicitly allocated to individuals from each disability community? And can you just
Explain what that means.
So just like
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Yes, absolutely. We would like to have a seat up there and
Okay.
have the voices heard.
Okay.
So.
Do you have any thoughts, Shelley? on
just
that?
to have specific seats representing specific disabilities. Is that your question?
Yes.
Yeah, we would. We think it's important that each disability have representation as the experts on issues that are arising around that specific disability.
Okay. Do you, does public service have anything to say on the composition of the board? Any input?
I think when it comes, as we do with anything, it does need to be members from the disabilities community because...
Exclusively, or?
Well, as much as possible. I mean, the way the legislation is worded, it says, a majority of, but I don't see any reason why you can't, you need to go above that mark. Just because it says majority of, that doesn't mean, 50.1%, as much as possible. And having a diversity, persons with disabilities are very diverse. And so that should be considered.
Okay, Michael, do you have any Anything with respect to the
In a few countries, I think it's Peru, they actually in the legislation enumerate by disability or types of impairment. So broad categories, but they do that. Another thing is to specify, you might want to consider in the bill, that the vice chair or the chair, that one of those be designated or that they rotate. The Americans do that. Some other countries do that. So you name in positions. So you build in not just a floor number, like a minimum of 50% plus one, but you identify certain key roles.
Can I?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Sorry, yeah.
Go ahead.
So I do work in quite a number of countries with respect to regulation, and where there is representation of the high incidence and groups of individuals with disabilities and specific groups that have well-organized advocacy groups. And what tends to happen there is there are always individuals with disabilities that are left out. So I think in addition to, I mean, I agree completely that we require representation of people experiencing disabilities, but we also need to continuously ask, who are we missing? Who has not had a voice at this table? Because quite frequently, for example, individuals who are non-speaking, individuals who have low incidence or who are very small minorities do not get to speak. And the usual groups frequently go from one consultation to another, resulting in consultation fatigue. And there's a lack of, or there's repetition of specific opinions. So I think we need to be inclusive in how we include individuals with disabilities.
Thank you. Thank you. And now over to MP Hardcastle, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for your presentations, all of you. This has been really thought-provoking, and I'm glad that we're having this discussion. I'm going to try and use plain language as much as I can, Mr. Earl. Thank you for that. So I want to go back to timelines and deadlines, because I feel like we started talking about it and then we kind of moved away from the real point. The day that this bill is passed, nothing has to happen. So let's go back to that. That is a problem, isn't it? What are some of the practical ways, not maybe the big picture ways, but there are some practical ways we can address that right now, aren't there? And I think maybe everyone can maybe talk about what would you envision right now, the day that this passes, what should we be giving notice to? I'm not trying to hint around at a kind of an amendment, but I'll give you an example. It could be from the day this passes, everybody that's involved that we name, we'll get to those amendments and that question after, Marianne. But you have 18 months to come up with a plan, or you have 6 months to formulate the advisory committee. What kinds of deadlines do you think are most practical for our role here, the limited amount of time we have to study this? What do you think we should be really concentrating on? Who wants to go first? It looks like we've got a few people thinking. Mr. Prince?
And
go ahead, Donna.
Sorry. I think it is important for us to lay down a timeline as to when this advisory committee will be in place. I think it's really, really important. And the other thing, yes, I think it is also important that we lay down a timeline / deadline as to, people to file their plans, because if we don't, it's an open-ended process and people will just keep putting it off and putting it off. And then, government departments are told, well, you have 1 year to do this, and they'll wait till the 11th hour to do it, or any entity would, if they're not given a timeline. So I do believe in timelines/deadlines. I do think that those two things, the advisory committee and the time limit for filing plans, is important, because if those are not put in place, if, for example, people are not told you have, let's say, 18 months to file a plan, they'll keep postponing it, and then finally it'll just get put on the back burner. Thank you.
And okay, I don't know if any of you have something to add, but maybe we can move on. Ms. Lama and Ms. Ladin, I'm very intrigued with your presentation with regards to right now what we have is a disconnect and potential conflict, not just a disconnect, but potential conflict. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you think we should be approaching. I know you discussed some of the sections just with the Employment Equity Act. How can we make sure that we're including those provisions then throughout, or do you have a specific approach that we should be taking, like the Treasury Board, or is there an example of something we should be following?
Okay, I'll start. I'll start, and then Marianne can add to it. I just want to point out, because there's been references to the Ontario, Nova Scotia, and Manitoba. They don't have Employment Equity Acts. So the accessibility plan kind of makes sense. It doesn't make sense in the federal realm because we have an Employment Equity Act, which has timelines, which has requirements, which are very concrete about what should be in an employment equity plan, right? And just to be clear, employment equity is about representation, promotions, retentions. So it is about getting people in, but it's also about removing barriers in the workplace. Sometimes people confuse that. They think it's about numbers, but it's not. It is about a cultural shift. So our thought is to actually strengthen and make amendments to the Employment Equity Act. And I want to point out it hasn't been amended since 2002. So we've got recommendations on how to make it better around accountability. Enforcement is a really big issue, and I think it is for this new legislation as well. So it just needs to be strengthened in the Employment Equity Act when it comes to employment. And I point out that under the Employment Equity Act, the Federal Contractors Program is also there. So it covers that broader group as well, like contracts that are coming into for related to services and goods for the federal public service. I also wanted to say, as well, with the conflict, the Canadian Human Rights Commission is also required to do audits. So you're going to have on employment equity. So you have this group already monitoring employment equity plans and things like that, and then you have this. So there is that sort of conflict, even though there's the Accessibility Commissioner and there's all these other things. In our ideal world, Treasury Board and the Public Service Commission are central agencies, and they would be responsible as an employer for the federal public service for the employment equity, and then they report to they do annual reports to Parliament on employment equity. So there needs to be more strengthened mechanisms. And I do want to point out that the Task Force on Diversity and Inclusion, which I did sit on, does point out that employment equity is still very important, and it's still a priority, right? So our fear is, with this legislation, the thought might be, oh, we don't have to worry about employment equity anymore, right? And we just have to do this. And then so it's going to cause some tensions right now on that. So our thing is, like we had suggested in the beginning, the amendment is to take the employment piece, strengthen it into the Employment Equity Act, do the Employment Equity Act review, and make that and strengthen areas around there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now MP Hogue, please.
Thank you very much. Ms. Luda, I think you had some comments that you wanted to make there, and I'm happy to give you a few minutes to provide those comments.
It was just a very quick comment regarding the issue of an aspirational deadline. I think that gives an inaccurate impression, because it implies that there is at some point where accessibility or inclusion is complete, that we can know and will know everything that needs to happen to make Canada accessible. This is a moving target, not to imply that that means that it's difficult, but I think what we need to focus on more is the deadlines for the specific process steps, and then additional deadlines as we move along, as we become aware of things that need to be done. We are in the process of reviewing the AODA, and certainly if you were to ask us what is everything we need to do by 2025 to make Ontario accessible, you get very, very different opinions, and also there's no way to anticipate all of the barriers that will arise between now and 2025.
Thank you, and I'll be sharing a little bit of my time with Ms. Sadu. So just contextually, we've talked a lot about culture, and certainly when the minister introduced this and came before us, her issue was, we've got to get moving now. We've got to do something as a country and get this legislation moving forward. She had comments about the need for having something legislated and in place. And we're hearing a number of issues, a number of concerns, which I think are all valid and important within that frame and that context. Issues about the effective change of culture and how do we affect the cultural change, which I think is crucial in terms of ensuring that the personality of the legislation, the personality of our country is accurately reflected. I'm interested contextually in terms of where we sit today, if with OECD countries and others looking at accessibility. Where would we be within that framework? Where would Canada sit? And are there other jurisdictions that have pieces of legislation which might be informative, if not directive, in terms of being able to assist us? And then I'd like to move on to some of the accountability issues. So if anyone or everyone would like to respond to that, I'd be delighted to hear that.
I think the remarks about the Employment Equity Plan are a really important reminder of what we already have within Canada at the national level. Similarly with the Court Challenges Program connected with the Charter of Rights. I mean, when the Charter was brought in, there was a debate then, should we, there was the famous Obstacles Report of 1981 that looked at disability, and the debate then was, should we bring in something like the Americans with Disabilities Act, which had didn't follow till later, but there was the rehabilitation legislation in the United States. And people thought, well, no, we have the Charter and we have the Canadian Human Rights Act. We don't need it. And then we got the Employment Equity Act. And so here we are a generation later, and we're bringing in a bill to address this, which tells us something about the need. So Canada we will be catching up, if I put it politely, to Australia, to the United Kingdom, to the United States, to Ireland, to several other European countries who have various forms of disability rights or accessibility laws. Even the United States perhaps has invested the most heavily. But again, different federations, different social and political contexts that we need to make sure this works for our context, our experiences, but to draw. And I think we do need to hit the road running. I sense that desire by the minister herself. But you're right, I would think, without presuming how Parliament may eventually land on what this bill looks like, I would hope that there's plans afoot on the implementation, so things like advisory committees, the creation of the design organization or variations. The accessibility, the chief accessibility officer, I actually think the names are backwards. I think the person who I think should be responsible for the administration and enforcement and compliance should be called the officer. And I think the person that should be about the culture change should be the commissioner. So I think the titles are a bit confusing. To me, and this is what the disability community has called for a long time, is a commissioner that would be like the Auditor General, an officer of Parliament, who then would play that cultural role, that would engage from day one on education and information and raising public awareness in plain language and in a variety of alternate formats. That could be something that would start from day one. You announce this is the person who represents a new beginning, and with that person is an array of other organizations and legislation that already exist. And this is the journey we're about to start on. And here are the timelines Yeah, I said aspirational. I still believe that. I get what you just said, but yeah, we need incremental and phased ones too, at years 3, 5, 7, 10, 12, whatever, for the accountability. But I see the chief, what's currently called Chief Accessibility Officer, I would respectfully say rename it, change the titles, and what should be the commissioner, and that should be a officer of Parliament, and do a real potential as a promoter and educator of the change and the dialogue in the country.
Much more time do I have?
Literally 9 seconds. So I'm
Can I-
gonna
Mr.
suggest
Duke?
that Ramesh, you're up next. If you have time to share, maybe you could share it with Sonia, but you don't have time for a question, I'm afraid. MP Sangha, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you everyone for coming today and giving this great input to the committee. I'm in Brampton Center. I have got consulted many people, those who are need accessible studies they were doing. Harinder Bans, she's on wheelchair and she's running an NGO, doing great job. And there is one girl, her name is Jeevan Bans. She don't have eyesight. She's my niece. And I talked to her at the length just to have the first-hand knowledge. And she gave me the great points, She says she was happy to be part of the consultation process. And she's proud to be that. And she's more proud that his uncle is going to be sitting on the study, doing in him HUMA committee. So it's a really proud for me too to be part of this committee. His main concern was that this barrier-free Canada should be for each and everyone. And Mr. Prince, you raised that issue, that amendment to Section 7, Section 7, so that is applicability of the Act is not only limited to certain, but should be to each and every part of the organization, institution in Canada. So I was really impressed that you are giving that information and you want the committee to move a little more further. And what I want you to ask the question is, what do you think that how far amendment will help? Suggest the committee that how much amendment which you are seeking for will help the committee.
Well, the way I would answer it is that my own university has an employment equity plan. It probably wouldn't without the federal legislation. We had briefly employment equity laws in BC, as did Ontario briefly. Both had governments that removed those laws. We only have employment equity, in my own opinion, in my university because of the federal contractors program. We have to bid on federal dollars. We want funding from the Social Science Humanities Research Council and other councils. So through the federal spending power, there's a whole host of organizations in Canada that went well beyond the constitutional limits or the formal division of powers under the Constitution that have employment equity, are committed. And we've embedded it now for 30-odd years. And I think the expectation in the disability community is to see a similar approach so that, we reach out. We have these practices, we have these precedents. The expectation is that this will build on and complement equity. Accessibility is the next part of that story of diversity and equity and inclusion.
Do you think there will maybe some, in the long run, there may be a charter issue because constitutionally, if certain people are getting the right, others are not getting the right, do you think there will be a charter issue?
There's always a potential for charter issues. I hear, BC many years ago, Mr. Hogan remember this, we had a court case around the right to have interpreters in hospitals, and that became a charter case. And that's perhaps not been as well implemented as it ought to be, but different groups have tended, and this has been part of the problem, is that different groups by impairments and by different conditions are going to court and litigating the rights for their particular group with their particular condition and that's a very fragmented and piecemeal and a slow, tough journey to advance the rights of all Canadians who have some limitations or face barriers. The potential of this bill, if it's designed right, is to make it a much more generic and universal approach so that groups and families and parents and disability groups like People First don't have to invest very limited dollars they have on very expensive court cases to try to get to advance the rights across groups. And that's what I see that's troubling is right now is a fragmentation again around disability groups, a frustration, a very understandable frustration by a lot of parents, and whether it's around autism or diabetes, and everyone wants a national strategy for their group, their condition. With respect, that's not the way to go.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Chair, I can share my rest of the time with Mr. Long.
So, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, all the panelists, being here. I'm pleased to see sign language interpreter present at committee today. I met with the hearing impaired Canadians who told me that the United States has sign language interpretation for emergency alert broadcasts, like something happened or natural disaster. But the same service is not offered in Canada, and that is a concern. Is that an issue raised by those with the disability?
Very, very brief answer, please.
And I'm on, yes. I don't represent the hearing impaired community. However, we do sit on a committee with the folks from the hearing impaired committee, and absolutely that is identified as an issue here in Canada.
Thank you. We'll come back to Sonia in the next question. MP Diot for 6 minutes. 6 minutes, please.
Dr. Prince, welcome, and I know that you talked about this. You had some pretty strong words about the bill as it is now. You talked about it seems to be a machinery of government bill. It's should be about people. It's disturbing. Thanks for your honesty. Can you help us and give us some examples, specific examples of how this bill fails people with disabilities?
Well, I think there's only so much you can push in a bill, a legislative. I think what I'm hearing from my colleagues, particularly from People First, is that there's, and I know the minister's talked about this briefly before, but I think, again, on day one, if this gets passed and gets royal assent, what Canadians with disabilities are looking for is the larger context and an agenda of accessibility and inclusion that would be around programming and services and investments. Now, those get into budgetary items, of course, and programming, which are not necessarily in Bill C-81. But there are limits to what you can do in the bill, but the ideas of investments in disability supports and services, whether it's for people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or hearing impairment, other kinds of just investments in services, investments in labor market agreements that have been recently retooled for employment opportunities. That's where, to really give this bill its best chances of success, is the larger context of investments in other policies and programs, many of which are provincial, not federal, in fact. But where does the federal government have a role, whether it's through the Enabling Accessibility Fund, which would be a very important way of, in my call for amending Section 7 and bringing in other entities, and when I talk about incentives, so either through grants or contributions, or looking creatively at tax credits or tax measures that would provide incentives for employers on accessibility in a way that we haven't. We've left that, we toy around with that with home modifications for seniors and people with disabilities. We've dipped into it that way, but why can't we do similar things around other, so the Enabling Enhanceability, the Opportunities Fund, the Disability Tax Credit, there's really key, the RDSP, the Registered Disability Savings Plan, which is a fantastic public program in this country. First country in the world to bring in something like that. So there's that larger context. So I might be criticizing parts of this bill. It's got a lot of room for improvement, but I'd also make a plea to the committee to look at, to make this a people bill and a social policy oriented piece of legislation, some of which could maybe be in here, but a lot of it's going to be things that parallel and complement this. And so this is the right committee to be doing that.
Just to help people who don't have disabilities, what are some things in the workplaces that have to change? I mean, and again, maybe this is to Dr. Prince or anybody else who might have some knowledge on that, but what has to change? Because we all see the accessible washrooms and wheelchair ramps, but what are other things that most able-bodied people would not even think about?
If I could just quickly comment on something that Michael just said. The RDSP program, for example, fantastic. Canada is very fortunate to have that. In our world, the numbers of people with intellectual disabilities who have taken advantage of the RDSP program is minimal because they can't get to it. They don't understand it. They go to the bank. There's a ton of issues with banks and somebody with an intellectual disability walking in saying, I would like to access the RDSP. None of that is written in a language that people with intellectual disabilities understand. So here we have a great opportunity. We can't access it.
Yeah.
So, right, around employment, your question was around employment specifically. Do you want me to stop?
I just wanted to give, I think it's Dr. Judah?
Sivilanis, yes, yeah. One of the things I want to comment is we've been involved in quite a few discussions on the future of work, and there is the discussion about how work will be changing, how automation, how many of the new innovations that are coming about are going to be quite disruptive in work for everyone. And what I would suggest is that we insert or infuse those with thoughts of accessibility and greater equity for people with disabilities, because some of the changes that need to happen to our employment are things that will benefit everyone, but will definitely benefit individuals with disabilities. And in fact, if we have the impetus of making them more accessible, for example, our HR practices assume replaceable workers with a particular job description as opposed to a team of workers. We try to fit the person to the job rather than the job to the person. There are all sorts of benefits to thinking more inclusively about jobs that will improve Canada's performance with respect to the future of work and the transformation of work that will also benefit people with disabilities. I think in every area where we are talking about new policies, change of policies, new innovations or changes within our practices, we should be infusing the interests of individuals with disabilities.
Thank you very much. And now over to, who are we going to over here? MP Long?
Yes, just one sec, sorry. I want to just touch on, just for everybody in the panel. Oh. Okay. Sometimes my conservative friends across the aisle talk about just the concerns of cost of C81. You know, how much is it going to cost? Can we bear that cost? I guess my question is just around, should there be a cost to creating an accessible Canada? Mr. Prince?
Well, there's costs to everything. There's the opportunity costs of all that talent and energy that's been lost over the years of people who have been able to participate. But you know, we need to recognize that part of the reason for the perpetuation of systemic barriers and obstacles is that there are real concerns about whether it's legal liabilities. That's one of the reluctances around employment barriers at times. But part of it is fixed costs of retrofitting or making facilities and services more accessible. So that's why I mean by these broader policy tools around tax measures or grants or contributions, investments. We need to have a frank, honest conversation that there are costs around accommodation. There are huge benefits and opportunities, but we need to look at both and have, I think, a balanced conversation on that. But again, not to hold up or delay human rights, fundamental human rights, on the altar of a benefit cost analysis that will mean a further delay and a further perpetuation of barriers to Canadians who've been left out far too long.
Yes, sorry. Judah, go ahead. Sorry, my
I
apologies.
I want to mention a number of economic studies that have been done on on accessibility and the costs of accessibility. It's actually a myth that it will cost more in the long term. It actually costs less in the long term. So comparing services that were designed for everyone versus services where you have the service designed for the average group and then a separate segregated or after the thought or an afterthought with respect to disability, what you find is that if you include people with disabilities right at the beginning in developing the service, it may cost a little bit more and it may take a little bit more time initially, but over a 5-year period, it will cost less because the service that isn't designed for people with disabilities in mind will continuously have additional issues or features that need to be added, and it will become unstable, and there will be an end of life much more quickly, and the long-term costs are far more. There is also this notion of full social costing, and I would refer you to a study that was done by Martin Prosperity Institute called Releasing Constraints, which show that in fact there are many GDP gains to be made and other gains with respect to economic gains.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'll give you an example of a community area in my riding where, again, I'm somewhat new to HUMA and that thought process. And I parked in the parking garage, and I came upon a door to go in to the community center, and there was a lady there in a wheelchair sitting outside the door. So I was kind of like, hey, why are you... There was no way for her to come in unless somebody was coming out that door that saw her or somebody coming in the door. So I'm like, how long has this been going on? And she was like, forever. And to your point, people in wheelchairs stop going there, stop shopping there, stop eating there. So to your point, there is an economic cost to not doing that. Shelley and Corey, do you want to add in on this?
Thanks for the question.
No problem.
So first of all, having a cost should not be to the barrier aspect. I mean, there's one thing to have costs, but in the long run, like we're talking about fundamental rights of people with disabilities. Put the cost aside and look at what the economics, look at people having full participation. Each and every day when we fight to be included, we don't wake up and think about how much is it going to cost. We think about how are we going to be included in today's society. And so that's not focused on the cost. That's focused on people being part of every day. And as we've talked about having supports, in this act, if I go on complaint, how do I know what if I don't have supports that are available for me for that? That needs to really be seriously addressed in that. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could quickly add on one thing.
Yeah, sure.
Economically speaking, there's in the intellectually disabled world, there's a gentleman by the name of Mark Wafer who owns a bunch of Tim Hortons.
We interviewed him.
You, pardon?
We interviewed him in a previous
So you've met Mark. I mean, who tells a greater story from
Yeah.
a business aspect on the benefits of hiring somebody with a disability?
Yeah,
you
Randy
want to look
Lewis-
at numbers, right?
Yeah. Randy Lewis at Walgreens also is another example of
There you go.
total leader.
Thank you very much.
Can we get just a second?
Very brief, please.
I was just going to say in the employment realm, costs are often not really valid because costs generally cost $500 or less for accommodating people with disabilities. So there is actually an attitudinal barrier to say, oh no, it's going to cost a lot. But if you look into it, things can happen that is very cost effective. Like, it's a myth, basically, is what I'm trying to say.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. MP Falk for 5 minutes, please.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank all the witnesses for coming today and sharing your story. One thing that I just want to mention, I know our colleague across the way, is making it seem that all we are is concerned with the cost. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is a piece of legislation that hasn't had any costing done to it yet. So there is an act of being prudent, just to know what is the cost analysis on this, and just not writing a blank check at the end of the day, right? So we need to go in with, again, just using some prudence on costing. But that being said, I don't recall who had said this. I think it was Mr. Earl had said, who has not had a voice at this table? And, I really like that, because I think it can be used in more than just legislation. I think just every day, right? And I mean, I think we've seen this too with the current government in their last budget, right? One could argue that they definitely used a gender lens on their budget. So using a disability lens, right? And having that opportunity to have a disability lens on legislation to begin with. When legislation's being drafted, it doesn't matter what it is, but having that ability to actually use a disability lens. So I really appreciate those words and the thoughts that it's provoked. So thank you. I believe this was Miss Joden. You had made a mention, lead roles, I believe, that Canada could take now, or the government could take now. And as Ms. Hardcastle had mentioned, the way the legislation is written now, the day that it receives royal assent, technically nothing would happen. We wouldn't have a tangible change that would come into effect. So I'm just wondering if I could get some examples of how government departments could take lead roles and achieve this now before legislation is implemented.
Thank you very much. I think one of the roles I think government could take is that although a lot of the external websites, the governmental websites, have been improved in the last few years, a lot of the internal websites have not followed suit. And one of the things that I think this government can do is to show, like put it like walk the walk and have internal websites follow suit. Because from what I've been told, and I don't work for the government, is that quite a few colleagues of mine have said that as of now, a lot of these departmental websites are not accessible, are not usable, are not terribly navigable. So I'm wondering if this is one of the things that can be worked on. And let's just forget about, cost and cost and cost. Everything costs something. But I just want to make this quick comment, and I'll end it here, is that I find that when it comes to persons with disabilities, it is always about cost. And why is it like that? Why is it that we are always being told, well, let's see how much it costs when it comes to doing things for persons with disabilities? When it comes to doing things for other types of persons, sighted persons or others, the cost matter is not brought up as frequently and regularly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My next question, I believe, would be, again, directed to Mr. Earl and Ms. Fletcher. You had mentioned disability supports. So I was just wondering, in what context were you referring to? And if you could give me some examples of disability supports.
Just a brief answer, please.
Okay. An example of disability support is me being here with Corey. Okay. In the intellectually disabled world, one of the accommodation rights is, as he said, it's complex. It's the ability to have somebody, I'll use our language, a non-labeled person, somebody without an intellectual disability beside a person with a disability to translate into plain language when needed. It's an example.
So it could mean different things within different parts of the disability community then. Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
And there is a cost to that. We're two people, right? So every cost to bring Corey somewhere is ×2.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
MP Hardcastle for 3 minutes, please.
3 minutes. Okay, really quickly, Donna, if you can hear me again, I know when the question was asked about what's it like in a workplace environment, I think only my screen shows that when you put your hand up. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit. And then if you can keep it short, then I have one more minute because I don't get a lot of time on this committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what in my personal opinion, as someone who is vision impaired, the attitudinal barriers, the artificial barriers need to be worked on. And this has to do with creating more awareness and creating more education, because when many employers take a look at someone like myself, they don't look at what I bring to the table, they look at what I do not bring to the table. So they look at me as someone who cannot contribute economically, and I think that this is one of the barriers in the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you. And just going back, ladies, to the Employment Equity Act and areas that it is specific where C81 is vague, do you see any low-hanging fruit very quickly that you can discuss with us?
I'm not exactly sure.
Duty to accommodate.
Yes, okay. So there's two things that I think we hear as a union representing federal public sector workers. Employers are not fulfilling their requirements under duty to accommodate. The number of grievances and complaints that we're required to do. And this is when we have legislation in place where employers have a responsibility on a duty to accommodate in the federal public service, and it's not happening. If you look at the diversity task force report that Ms. Lambert referenced earlier, the other issue we have is staffing. And I will tell you, as a union representative, I have had members come to me who say, I am in a staffing pool. I have identified as a person with disability or an equity-seeking member. I was the last one left in the pool, and guess what? They closed the pool because there wasn't enough in there. This is the reality of what's happening to equity-seeking members in the federal public sector. This is a reality of what's happening with persons with disabilities because of the perception that it's going to cost thousands to accommodate someone when it could be as simple as software to be able to allow them to do voice to text. And so, you know, I want to just say one quick thing. When we were talking about representation on the board, and I'm sorry, I can't quite see your name. You know, yes, we need representation from persons with disabilities. We need representation from persons like Professor Prince who have that academic background. But as bargaining agents in the federal public service, we spend a lot of time representing our members, and we have the expertise. And I also believe that we should have a seat at that table, just as we do under the Employment Equity Act, where the employer is not just required to consult with us, they're required to collaborate with us, which is a whole different level than consultation.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid that brings us to the end. We do need to suspend so that we can go into committee business. But before we do that, I would just like to thank all of you here in person and also via video conference for joining us this morning and helping contribute to what I think is going to be a good piece of legislation. Hopefully we can make it better through this process. Thank you very much, everybody. And we're just going to suspend briefly. Thank you.